Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kelly Beard, Content Specialist for Maryland REALTORS, and I want to welcome you all to our session preview webinar. Today, we have our Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, Lisa May, along with our Grassroots and Policy Advocate, Christa McGee. Together, they will dive into what to expect in the upcoming session, Lobby Day talking points, and which policies Maryland REALTORS is taking an interest in. This webinar will be recorded and sent out to all attendees after the conclusion of the webinar. We do encourage your questions and we look forward to answering them. Please post all questions in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa and Christa.
Kelly, thank you so much. And thank you, Maryland REALTORS, for spending part of your holiday season with your advocacy team here at the State Association. I was reminded yesterday that we are 34 days from the start of session, which always puts a little bit of panic into our hearts here. But then I was subsequently reminded that that means it's only 123 days until the end of session, and we started to feel a little bit better. But our point in holding this today is really to walk you through what we're expecting in the upcoming General Assembly session, including our Realtor agenda and some other items that you will likely hear us talk about as we go forward. So I am just going to start sharing my screen here. And once I see that pop up, put that in slideshow mode and go all the way back to the beginning. And here we are. All right. So our session at a glance, we're talking state budgets again after a really brief reprieve. We have a brand new slate of realtor legislation for this year. Housing, we're actually going to perhaps do something about housing finally. And then finally, for you Jeopardy fans who are on the webinar today, some legislative potpourri. That was always my favorite category. So why don't we just dive right in. This Maryland's fiscal outlook and our budgets are going to overshadow everything that happens this session. We don't normally talk about it, but it's going to really impact any bill that has a fiscal impact. And that's going to adjust pretty much everyone's legislative agenda this year. So you kind of see it in the next couple of years, you know, we start to go into shortfall. Those are manageable amounts, at least in terms of the state's rainy day fund and you know, making some cuts and tweaks along the margins. But you see down in 2028, there's a big fiscal cliff coming for the state, and it is already starting to set off alarm bells among our policymakers. So we are anticipating that, you know, there are going to be talks about budget cuts. There may be talks about, as they term them, revenue enhancements or, you know, new taxes and fees to really break that down. So that's just something that we're going to have to be mindful of, watch out for, and really try to keep our proposals positioned in such a way that they don't add to the state's deficits unnecessarily. So there is that overview, sort of like the lay of the land. But next we get into our legislative priorities, your Realtor bills that we are having introduced into the General Assembly. And for those of you who saw our session wrap up from last year, we had a very, very successful legislative session. We pushed nearly all of our agenda items across the finish line, which set us up to have all new issues to introduce this session. That's a very exciting thing, but it also is going to be, you know, a heavier lift to get legislators educated on these within the short period of time that exists within the General Assembly session. So why don't we just go ahead and dive right into what our Realtor legislative priorities will be, and we will start with buyer brokerage compensation. Compensation is something, and I am certain you have all heard a whole lot about, both from NAR and from us recently. We are not going to get into the lawsuits and those status reports today because we really are just focused on this one aspect of it. However, if you do want to learn more about some of the litigation and where it stands, highly recommend a video that was posted on our Facebook page about a week ago. Chuck walks you through it, where we really are versus what's going on in the media. So, please take a look at that. I found it very informative. I'm sure that you will also. But in terms of our state's requirements for compensation, we are doing really well, honestly. After attending the NAR conference last month, you kind of see that states are not nearly where Maryland is. Some of them are, don't require written buyer brokerage agreements. Some of them don't really get into compensation at all. Right now, they're wondering if they have those, do they have those conversations? Do they not? We're not there. Our statute was kind of forward thinking and requiring some things, but that doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement. We still hear that buyer's agents have a really difficult time explaining compensation and how their brokerages receive payment for the services that they provide. We've also heard that it can be kind of common for folks to put in that compensation line in the agreement, my compensation is per the MLS, or my compensation is none. Well, if the MLS says that the compensation is $1 or a penny or zero, as you're allowed to do, is that really what your compensation is for that transaction? At the end of the day, we really just want consumers to understand this, to understand how you are compensated for the value that you provide to them and within the transaction. So here's a little side-by-side of how the changes to the code would work. And yes, before anyone asks, wait, are our forms going to be updated to reflect this? Yes, absolutely. Of course, we will have new forms. We will have a lot of education on how to use them as well. So you'll see under the current, this is what our code says right now. This is what our forms reflect. Under new, these are the tweaks that we're going to make, and I'll walk you through those right now. First, when you state your compensation, you need to state whether it is a percentage of the purchase price, a flat dollar amount, or some combination of both. Step one. Two, you will state whether the broker is authorized to receive some or all of that compensation from a person other than the buyer or the client. For instance, am I going to get that from the listing broker? Third, you talk about what happens when the amounts in one and the amounts in two don't match. Say there's a shortfall, is the client responsible for that? Say there's an overage, how does that get worked out? And then finally, we're going to make a couple other tweaks just to clarify the definite termination dates of any brokerage relationships. And then also how the parties can preemptively terminate a brokerage relationship before the expiration date that is listed in that agreement. So those are the changes that we're making to buyer brokerage compensation. Ben Frederick, can my compensation be hourly? Good question. I think that, perhaps if you clearly state in terms of, a dollar amount, then, we have some flat fee brokerages out there. We have some. I think that would be permitted as long as it is a definite amount and you're very clear with what your fees would be. All right. Oh, and another one just popped up. A retainer fee. I think that would fall mostly under the same agreement. You would need to very clearly state, this is the dollar amount for my retainer fee that you are due. But then if there is another type of compensation that you're also getting, that's where it gets into the both, right? Percentage, fee, or both. So I think that would be, I believe that would be allowable, again, as long as you're very clear on what you are charging, and why. And then one other question, when will the forms be changed? That is a discussion. If the forms would need to be changed at a minimum before the law goes into effect. And this law, if passed, would go into effect in October. However, could Maryland Realtors choose to voluntarily change our forms to do this in advance of that date? Certainly could, because these new changes would technically comply with what is currently in the law. So that is something that our forms committee could absolutely discuss, changing it prior to any October 1 effective date of this bill, should it pass this General Assembly. So those are the questions I see right now on buyer brokerage compensation. Of course, if you think of any others as we go along, go ahead and put those in the Q&A because we can circle back at the end. But for now, I am going to hand our next bill over to Christa, who's going to talk about changes to CE reporting and renewal.
Thank you, Lisa. And I want to reiterate my appreciation expressed by Lisa for you all spending an hour with us today. So I will get right to it. CE reporting. So those of you who have recently renewed your real estate license have noticed that the Real Estate Commission made some changes to the CE reporting process over the summer. Unfortunately, those changes have created issues for continuing education providers, which ultimately will create issues for our members too. So let's start by looking at how the process used to work. Licensees would take CE classes from a provider, and that provider would report the credits to the commission. What you may not know is that CE providers had 14 days to complete the reporting process. That is because MREC's CE system requires each attendee and each class to be manually entered one by one. It also meant that licensees who took their CE classes at the last minute before expiration might not have their credits showing when it was time to renew, which at that time wasn't a problem because Maryland Real Estate Commission allowed you to self-certify that your CE was completed, just not yet uploaded into the portal. You can probably imagine what the Real Estate Commission found when they audited those self-certifications. Licensees were certifying that they had completed CE that they had never taken, and the Real Estate Commission brought complaints against them for falsifying their record, along with a $1,600 fine. So the Real Estate Commission decided that because of this, they would no longer allow self-certification. You can only renew once your credits are in the system and not before. So where the problem begins is that they also asked CE providers, like your local realtor associations, to upload CE credits within 3 days, not 14. This creates a real hardship for education providers who have already expressed that they will either need to cut back on their CE offerings or that they are going to have to raise costs on licensees to allow for quicker processing on completed credits. So while the old process didn't work for the Real Estate Commission, the new process has created its own issues and also isn't working for everyone. Even if education providers can upload in 3 days, you're still going to have licensees who have taken classes at the last minute that aren't reflected in the system at the time of the expiration. In trying to address the Real Estate Commission's concerns and relieve the burden on CE providers, we are proposing a new renewal and reporting process. CE should now be completed 30 days before the expiration date for a normal license renewal. We store the 14-day reporting period as to allow our education providers the time they need so that they can continue offering CE in a timely fashion to members. Licensees then have roughly 2 weeks remaining to clear up any discrepancies that may exist between what is showing in the portal as their completed CE and what they have taken over the past 23 months. This way, should a mistake occur, there's still time to correct it and no one's license expires unnecessarily. Finally, we also allow for the fact that sometimes life happens and you may need to complete your CE with less than 30 days left before your expiration. You would still be allowed to do that, but the Maryland Real Estate Commission would have the discretion to add on a reasonable processing fee in order to expedite CE reporting, but saving you from having to go through reinstatement. Any questions?
I am not seeing
Yeah.
any at the moment. Good job. You did well. But again, if you have questions or if you think of any, please let us know. I'm going to take on, the really fun issue now, which is condo and HOA resale requirements. As I say here, it's popular in a bad way. This is a top complaint that comes in to our legal hotline that people pull us aside at events and say, can you believe that this just happened during a recent transaction? Two main complaints come up when we talk about condo and HOA resale. One is the inconsistencies between the acts. There are different timeframes for delivery, different rights of cancellation. One that we've heard about a whole lot recently is because of the new reserve study requirements. HOA purchasers have an additional notice and review period if fees increase by more than 10%. But if you're buying in a condo, you don't have that same right. And part of why we think those inconsistencies happen is that these provisions are in different sections of the code. Condo resale is in the Condo Act. HOA resale is in the HOA Act. And when you update one, you don't necessarily go and update the other. Our neighbors to the South, Virginia, recently pulled their condo resale clauses out, their HOA resale clauses out, and put them into a single code section so that they are conformed as much as possible. So in the draft that we're working on, that is what we are seeking to do in Maryland, so that there is one section for delivery, one section cancellation, one for fees, and so on, so that as they are updated in concert with one another. And speaking of fees, yep, that's the other one. And I'm sure if I could, see all of you and have a show of hands, all of you will have had a situation where you were, charged extra fees, charged fees that exceeded what was outlined in the code, where you were required to pay an expedited delivery fee, where, the packet was really already ready and sitting there. So we are looking at how we can create a limit on resale fees to only those which are expressly listed in the statute. So, bye-bye account setup fees, to shorten what constitutes an expedited delivery timeline, and removing the requirements that you have to show a purchaser's name in order to get the documents delivered. Some of those top kind of, from our standpoint, kind of games that get played in the condo and HOA resale process. And two, to try to include some penalties for non-compliance, which really the enforcement piece of this is always a difficult one as well. Because when you guys are in a transaction, you really don't have time to go and try to get some relief from the state. You're under a deadline. Your clients need these docs. You have a closing deadline looming. You just need to pay whatever it is, move on. And unfortunately, that's how these bad practices have kind of proliferated. I will tell you now, this is not going to be an easy bill. This is not going to be an easy fight. And it may very well take a couple of years before we're able to see some real progress on it. But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting. You know, we hear you and we are willing to take this on. And not surprisingly, I'm seeing some Q&As. So yes, Anita, different forms and layouts, absolutely. Which is another piece that we've discussed as part of this multi-year effort is, you know, can we maybe look at the structure of the resale packages to see if we can conform those, make them more predictable, because having been on one side of receiving a resale package, I had a really difficult time figuring out if it was complete or not. So that's one. Hank had a good question about co-ops. We did look at co-ops, but the differences between the HOA, condo, and co-op statutes are vast. And we haven't ruled it out, but that might have to go into a phase 2 because it was far more complicated than it first seemed. So yes, co-ops are in there, are in the discussion. I don't know that they're going to make it in right now with this first crack at the bill. And let's see here, reserve studies. Yeah. Question about reserve studies. That too is a big issue. We're actually expecting some separate legislation on reserve requirements. And that has created some issues for our older communities, some of our communities out on the shore. So we're expecting between the Community Associations Institute and some individuals in the General Assembly who have heard these complaints, we do think that there will be separate legislation on reserve studies that we, of course, will engage in. Tim, for front fees, water and sewer and front footage maintenance agreements, those are reflected in other parts of the code. I believe that those are not being put into the Condo Act at this time, but all of the references would be updated in regards to those. If that's something that you would like to see us tackle, please reach out to me. Send me some information on something that perhaps you've experienced in one of these transactions, and we'd be more than happy to take a look at that. So thank you, everyone. Great questions. And with that, I'm going to move along. Anonymous complaints, Miss Christa.
Anonymous advertising complaints. So advertising violations are frequently reported to us and our local associations by concerned members. They are also faxed, emailed, and mailed anonymously to the Real Estate Commission. So what happens when an anonymous complaint comes in? Currently nothing. Why is that? Well, Maryland law requires that all complaints that are made to the commission be made under oath by the person submitting the complaint. Therefore, advertising violations that are reported to the commission anonymously or that are not made formally under oath are not investigated and thus not enforced. Although the industry is expected to be self-regulating and self-policing, we can understand why a member would be hesitant to put their name on a complaint against another licensee. Imagine they are working with that agent currently on a transaction. Would lodging a complaint against the other agent really be in the best interest of the buyer or seller? Or if you live in a smaller community or region where you regularly work with the other person, or you're likely to have to work with them in the future, naturally that could impact your dealings with that individual. There are several other states that allow anonymous complaints, so those commissions are able to investigate complaints that show sufficient evidence of an advertising violation. Some of these states have a citation and fine or a citation and education system in place, as opposed to the traditional hearing and formal sanctioning that occurs in Maryland. So the opposition to this change is always centered around whether anonymous complaints deprive a licensee of due process because they would be unable to face their accuser. Our answer to that is, number one, the licensee put the violation in print and it is apparent when a violation has occurred. And two, we provide a right to appeal and request a hearing should the licensee believe that they were in compliance all along. So the best analogy that we can make on this issue is violating a speed camera or a red light camera. The state has evidence of you violating a law. You can either agree that you did and accept the sanctions, or you can dispute that you committed a violation and make your case. So we're thinking that this is a step in the right direction for accountability and increasing the professionalism of the industry.
Fantastic. Krista, I love how you're just explaining yours so well that there are no questions. I need to take lessons from you.
Great feedback and support. What can I say?
There we go. There we go.
Always happy to talk more on this if anyone does have questions. So,
well, as punishment, I guess you're going to talk about the next one too.
Oh, yay. Okay. So this one's a little bit more straightforward. We are getting into the oversight of branch offices. So we received a legislative proposal that was presented to us by one of our local associations regarding a change to broker supervision in Maryland. Therefore, I wanted to take a quick second to extend a shout out to the Southern Maryland Association of Realtors for bringing this to our attention. Currently, a broker is only eligible to supervise one office location. Whereas if he or she were to hire an office manager, they would be eligible to supervise multiple offices. Naturally, it makes sense to allow brokers to be able to supervise at least as many offices as an office manager is currently allowed to. Many small brokerages might want to have multiple office locations, but not want to have someone else on staff be the office manager or have to add staff just for this purpose. So the best example illustrating this need for a change is if you are currently a broker with just one office location and you would like to open a second office. This current requirement of hiring an office manager to oversee a second office may be cost prohibitive and essentially will serve as a deterrent towards the expansion of your business.
And we do have a question in the chat.
Yeah, so whether there is a consideration of shifting the model from how many offices a person can oversee and instead make it how many agents the broker or manager can oversee. And I don't know, Krista, did you want to take that one, or I can?
Could you fill in?
Yeah, of course. We did have we did sort of talk about, like, do we need to put in what adequate supervision is? And I think, any limit that we came up with would be kind of arbitrary because so much, there are kind of a lot of factors that go into there. It could be physical distance, it could be, the volume of sales that are going through those brokerages. So, we chose not to kind of tackle it at this point in time, just knowing that the commission will, ask you to show that you provided adequate supervision. If any questions ever arise, you have to show that you were supervising these individuals. We just want to make sure that we aren't inadvertently stopping someone because of this discrepancy between brokers and office managers from expanding their business. So, I know that the commission has had you know, those talks probably too, Krista, you know, how many agents can you reasonably certify? You know, I don't know, is the number, is it 20? Is it 40? You know, I don't know. And I bet if we asked the, you know, 100+ people on this webinar, they may all come up with a different number. And that has kind of been the difficulty, you know, of defining what is and what is not adequate supervision. Again, questions about when these laws would go into effect. Most of our bills, unless they have tax implications or unless they have like an emergency clause put in them, most of these bills go into effect October 1 of the year following passage by the General Assembly. So October following the April passage and the governor's signature.
We've got another one. Per HOA condo, financial reporting on sale packages are different. And with the new reserve study requirements, this could present a problem for some smaller HOAs. Might be hard to convey this question in a Q&A.
Yeah, and Greg, absolutely. We will talk more about condo and HOA resale. Those reserve requirements, you know, have created some issues, both in terms of, you know, increases in either monthly dues or in special assessments that are going to be going against those communities. There was legislation introduced last year. It passed the House, but did not get through the Senate before they adjourned. That would have extended some of those timeframes where between having your reserve study and having to have the reserve fund fully funded. I anticipate that, you know, they will approach that again. There has been some talk about, you know, maybe the reserve study, it doesn't have to cover each and everything that the condominium or HOA is responsible for. You know, maybe it's just stuff that covers, you know, health, life, safety of the residents, and those types of things. I think we're going to be hearing a whole lot more about reserve studies as the session goes on. All right, not seeing any others, guys. We're gonna move on to kind of the granddaddy of them all here. Housing. You know that we have been talking about housing for a couple of sessions now. And to, you know, maybe not as much progress as we might like to see. But this year, the Moore administration and Housing Secretary Day are beginning to roll out their housing plan for 2024. In prior years, DHCD and the administration, I think the largest number of housing bills they put in to the General Assembly in any single session has been 5. This year, they're introducing 26. And no one is more surprised than they are, that they're, you know, trying to take that on. Hence the line here, go big or go home. And we finally have some traction that, hey, maybe the General Assembly is going to do something big, instead of nibbling at the edges like they have been. Right now, we wanted to make you aware of the 3 main bills that comprise the administration's housing package. So first, you'll see here under number 1, housing financing. DHCD's one of their roles is as the state's housing finance agency. You know, deeply affordable housing is not generally something that just occurs in the marketplace. It needs grants, it needs favorable loan terms, gap financing when construction costs exceed what the ultimate rent or sales price would be. So this piece makes sure that Maryland is leveraging all of the federal grant money that is out there, that they're, you know, efficiently funneling money to local governments for their projects, that they are using the widest possible definition of what state funds can be used for in terms of not just new construction, but perhaps rehabilitation and repair. and so on. So that's step one. Step two, and this is the one that really gets to increasing the supply of housing that we have in Maryland. It's going to be known as the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act. We haven't seen the language on this one or the others, but we have spoken to DHCD about some of the broad concepts that are included in there. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that the administration is looking at ways to incentivize different housing types, including smaller units, manufactured housing, transit-oriented and mixed-use housing. And they also want to streamline the permitting and public hearing process because, as we know, in housing development, time is money, and certainty is money. And so they want to create something that is less timely, less unpredictable, that can kind of allow developers the certainty to move forward with projects. And then finally, number three, because they are looking at all aspects of the housing ecosystem, if you will, there will be a bill to address rental properties and tenant protections. As we understand it, and again, because the legislative language has not been released and it's still in drafting, there are going to be some pieces in there, though, that maybe haven't been exactly our favorite things over the past few years. I will say they aren't, the worst of the worst. They aren't statewide rent control. They aren't just cause evictions, the things that have caused us, sort of the most heartburn when they're proposed. But they could be looking at some things, perhaps eviction filing fees. They could be looking at security deposits, things of that nature. As realtors, we're going to have some very serious discussions on how we balance those issues, kind of politically, against what is the biggest and most comprehensive housing legislation that we've really seen in a number of years. And we're going to have to be, really practical of, the give and take versus what really is a housing crisis now in Maryland. When we first started talking about housing shortages, we were estimating, about 85,000 unit shortage. As of this summer, the National Low Income Housing Coalition has our housing shortage at 150,000 units. So we've nearly doubled in our housing needs in just a few short years. And we're going to have to look at, doing some things differently if we're going to expect different results. So as of right now, that's what we know. Of course, as this legislative language comes out, we will, review it very much in depth. We will talk to you, of course, about a lot of this going forward, and we won't be the only ones. We are, engaging a lot of our partners, including, some of our broader business community. Because really housing is an economic development issue. It's not just a real estate issue as well. So that is what we know as of today on the housing plan and what we might see in housing this General Assembly session. And I see a couple of questions pop up, so let's go. Are we coordinating with Maryland Multi-Housing and the Small Developers Collective? Yeah, we are. We work very closely with MMHA along with the Apartment and Office Building Association, NAOP, the Builders Association in Maryland, of course. And we're all working with that. Also the local governments, MML and MACO. We've kind of given them a hard time recently for their opposition to some of our housing ideas. It's our understanding that they are engaging with the administration on these bills as well. And so, yeah, hopefully we're gonna get to something where, you know, true win-wins for everyone are hard, but, you know, maybe at least we can, get to a place where, you know, everyone is, you know, okay. Everyone is okay. Everyone gets something, and maybe, you know, everyone gives up a little something, but it's something that they can live with. Question from one of our dads, Susie Hayward. Short-term rentals. Short-term rentals always come up, yeah, in these discussions, and it's hard to get a sense of exactly how much short-term rentals are cutting into, say, the workforce housing supply versus, you know, some of these short-term rentals are like the very large houses that are in vacation areas that, you know, maybe don't do so much for the typical worker, but that is always going to come up. And it's hard for us. It's hard for us because being for private property rights, you know, being able to rent your house on a long-term or short-term basis is one of those rights that we believe is baked into being a property owner. At the same time, as we've said, with our ADU legislation, we're facing a housing crisis, not a lodging crisis. And, you know, for some of these things, maybe some reasonable limits, you know, on ADUs. Yeah, maybe in certain instances, maybe these new dwellings or something have to be for long-term rentals instead of shorter-term ones. So yeah, Terry, to your point, ADUs are in this definitely, both in the long-term and short-term rentals. There's a statewide ADU task force that is currently meeting, and we have some Realtor members who serve on that. But they are looking at the issue essentially over the course of the next year and a half or so. So they really may not have final recommendations to the General Assembly until 2025, but it's definitely absolutely a part of the conversation. We thought it was the first step because they can be added so quickly and relatively easily to our housing stock. So yeah, we haven't given up the ghost on ADUs quite as of yet. Before I answer the next question, I'm going to hop over to our next slide because it is kind of the perfect transition. So let's do that. We're getting into our potpourri section of our presentation here. So yes, Edward, financial literacy. Financial literacy is a key platform of our current president, Chris Hill. And as part of his presidential initiative, there is a legislative piece to this. Maryland REALTORS has supported financial literacy legislation that has been introduced the past few sessions that would require financial literacy to be a standalone high school graduation requirement. Right now, financial literacy standards have to be taught as a graduation requirement, but the school districts have complete discretion as to how they implement that curriculum into their graduation guidelines. So I think it's around 7 or 8 school districts say we're going to have a standalone class, and then the rest incorporate them through whether it's their civics curriculum, their math curriculum, microeconomics, you know, whatever. These school districts, the superintendents, the PTAs have said teachers right now have so many requirements placed on them. Please do not add any more. Don't put any more on our plate. Don't. So we've had conversations of, okay, one, maybe we need to think outside the box as opposed to keep running into this wall where we oppose the teachers on this, because everyone wants students to be financially literate. We've talked about, you know, maybe could this be like a non-credit graduation requirement similar to service learning? we've talked about how we can make financial literacy education easier for our teachers, in terms of, partnering with, organizations that do this. Can we provide some additional resources that make it easier to get this information in front of students? So that's where we are. We do anticipate that we will see at a minimum one financial literacy bill this year. And we're staying flexible in terms of how we might be able to get that bill through, and hopefully come up with something that works for the school systems, and it still increases the financial literacy education that's provided. Assignments of contracts and marketing of equitable title. You guys may have heard of this referred to as wholesaling. We absolutely are engaging with members of our General Assembly and the Real Estate Commission on this issue, because we continue to hear of abuses that take place with wholesalers coming in, assigning that contract. The buyer has no idea what's going on. The seller has no idea what's going on. But that intermediary is walking away with a good chunk of equity from some of these sellers. We're now up to 10 states, in checking with our counterparts around the country. 10 states either require those who engage of assigning contracts or marketing equitable title to be licensed, or they require enhanced disclosures be given so that consumers understand exactly what is going on, who is getting what out of the transaction, and hopefully just making this a more transparent process. So we've already had a member of the General Assembly approach us to ask for our support in this. So we are providing that support and expertise as to the ins and outs of these transactions, and how we can take care of Maryland residents. And then finally, many of you know that in 2021, we had a big legislative victory in getting first-time homebuyer savings accounts legislation passed. Those accounts exist today. They are out there. But what we have heard is that by the time first-time homebuyers hear about them, which is often from their realtor or their lender, they're already started on the timeline of buying a home. And they don't have, the years to build savings in these accounts that really provide them with the most benefit. So when we passed the bill in 2021, we had to scale it back a little bit in order to win the necessary votes. And we scaled it back by saying only the first-time home buyer can open the account for themselves. What we have been approached by the original sponsor is to go back and say, you know what, no, you can open an account on behalf of a first-time home buyer. So if I wanted to open up an account on behalf of my children to one day, buy their first home in Maryland, I can do that. I might not get the tax credit for it. Okay, going back to our discussion about the state budget and fiscal impacts, only the contributions from the first-time buyer would get those tax credits. But at least if they know when they are 18, 20, 22, oh, hey, I have this savings account here for buying a house one day. I could start, throwing a little bit of money, maybe my tax refunds or a bonus, something like that. I can kind of start throwing some money in there. And then that gives them the power of time and compounding to make these savings accounts a little more valuable to them. All right, with that, let's circle back for some questions. If you guys thought of anything, were reminded of anything along the way, now is your time because you have our undivided attention. Let's go to this question from Kevin Waterman. Do we think the administration has any openness for truly aggressive housing legislation like we've seen from California and Montana? It's a very interesting question. Do I think they're going to go wholesale the state is going to dictate local zoning. I don't. They have said that there's really no appetite, not necessarily from the administration, but from the General Assembly as well, to doing like state preemption. However, they have said that if you look at all of the states that have had success in housing, you know, in really ramping up their housing production, you don't get there without some sort of zoning changes taking place. So I don't think they're going to nibble. I don't think they're going to preempt, but I think they're going to try to find some sort of happy medium that folks can, you know, it's sort of a middle path. Let's call it a middle path. How's that? From Hugh Gordon, first-time homebuyer savings account, a piece of financial literacy. Absolutely. And I hope that all of you have visited our Maryland homeownership website. We have blog posts. We also have a one-pager on first-time homebuyer savings accounts and the steps that you can follow to open one. We've also had conversations with the comptroller's office and have shared that flyer with our comptroller in order to get that out in front of more individuals. But yes, absolutely. First-time homebuyer savings accounts and financial literacy, hand in hand. Vacant properties in Baltimore City, getting those renovated and rehabbed, a big dent in the shortage. Actually, yes. So yesterday at the Maryland Association of Counties, Councilmember Odette Ramos spoke, moderated a panel, and she talked about exactly that issue. And they are getting DHCD assistance for strategic demolition is the term that they're calling it, a strategic demolition. So at the pace that they are going, or at the pace that they want to be, they would be able to tackle, you know, several thousand units annually. And when you look at, for instance, as you mentioned, Steve, the 50,000 units that they have right now, reforming their tax sale process, their NREM foreclosure process, and then also their strategic demolition process, those can all work together to really provide, instead of a parcel by parcel solution, maybe even a block by block solution. So that's somewhat state, somewhat local issue, but the type of partnership that, you know, we see DHCD being very interested in. Do we have a task force or committee working on financial literacy efforts? We're still very early in that process. And so is there one as of yet? No, but certainly any opportunities for member participation, we will let you know. Let's see here. From Debbie Lieber. Hi, Debbie. When will this webinar be available? We are recording it right now, and I know that our communication staff turns that around pretty quickly. I would anticipate, you know, early next week at the latest. Sometimes it's next day that they have these up on our YouTube channel, and then also out to our members through our hot sheet and as a follow-up to the registrants who were here today. So very soon, and maybe Kelly will chime in at the end to let us all know when that would be available. Let me see here. Baltimore City legislation on different property tax rates to different classes of property. Because those are Baltimore City specific bills or delegation bills, typically that is something that we leave to that local association to take a position on. You know, this Maryland Realtors would step in if asked, but GBBR would have the sort of the first crack at any legislation, or for any association that's out there, you know, your county delegation bills. We don't try to step on our locals' toes on those, but, you know, try to work in concert with them. Changes to buyer agency agreements, would that be made prior to October, or do we see Maryland Realtors creating one before that time? Those discussions are taking place. I don't have, a definitive answer on that for you. If any changes to buyer agency agreements are made, we will notify you as soon as humanly possible. Those changes would, of course, need to go through our forms committee to our executive committee. So that we have to kind of follow those processes, but I know that they're going to be talking about that going forward. Let's see here. Restorative practices bill. Edward, I might need you to follow up with me on exactly which bill or what provisions you mean by restorative practices. There have been a kind of a couple different wrinkles on that. So why don't you reach out by email with what you've heard, and I will see exactly kind of what positions we've taken on that in the past, or what similar legislation has gotten in previous sessions. Let's see here. Kevin Waterman on permitting reform. Do we know if anything includes a deemed approved provision? We don't know as of yet because we don't know the language, but really what the administration is talking about is how, certain developments have to go through, the special exception process. They go to a planning commission, they have to go to here and there, and sometimes these types of developments need to have 5 different public hearings, and there are permitting delays all along. So really all we know at this time is that they want to shorten those timeframes. They want to reduce unnecessary public hearings or duplicative public hearings. But we will take a look at those once we do get the legislative text available. Let's see here. Is Maryland Realtors helping to educate its members about Renew Baltimore initiative to help Baltimore property owners levelize their taxes? We had not, since it was Baltimore specific, Sarah, but if you want to send me some information on that, it's certainly something that we could share on our Maryland Homeownership Consumer site. And I am certain that our Housing Opportunity Committee would be very interested in hearing about that as well. So yeah, please feel free to send me those details, and we'll work on spreading the word on that. Well, hey, look, perfect. Ben Frederick runs Renew Baltimore. Wonderful. Why don't you guys shoot me an email? It's lisa.may@mdrealtor.org. And then, of course, you can also reach Christa McGee, particularly for those real estate commission questions, because she is our guru. Christa.McGee@mdrealtor.org. And I'm not seeing any remaining chat or Q&A questions. Kelly, do you see any others?
I don't see any others. And to follow up from Debbie's question, typically we try to get this webinar recording out to all of our registrants of this webinar tomorrow, along with the slide deck. And then I can also add both yours and Krista's emails to that email blast that we send out. And then we should have it up on our YouTube page shortly after as well. So aiming for tomorrow. If you don't see it tomorrow, then it would be first thing Monday. And
excellent. Oh no, remaining questions, guys. Going once, going twice. See right there. Someone was quick on the draw. Good. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for being here. We really, really appreciate it. We know your time is precious. But yeah, thank you. Happy Hanukkah to all of you who celebrate, and we wish everyone at Maryland Realtors, a very happy holiday and a very merry session coming up in 2024.
And just a quick reminder, our next webinar will be our Legal Hot Topics webinar that is going to take place on Thursday, December 21st at 1 p.m. with our Legal Dream Team. So I will drop that into the email as well that you guys will all be getting here shortly. So we hope you can join us for that one as well. All right, take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.